My tweet to draw attention to the rapturous rounds of applause, multiple rounds of applause for a Nazi in the gallery in the Canadian Parliament, obtained something like 6 million impressions and 100,000 responses. And it went around the world, and it went around Canada. It had a seismic impact. Suddenly, the man that the entire all-party House of Commons in Canada were cheering to the rafters is now facing potential extradition to Poland to stand trial on war crimes charges. Nothing quite like it has ever been seen before. And I'm very proud of the work that we did to turn this subject around. It will prove to be an inflection point in the war, as I predicted that it would before I addressed the matter on the Mother of All talk shows on Sunday. And I'll explain why in just a minute. But it gets worse. Not only did the entire parliamentary membership of the House of Commons in Canada rapturously receive this man, who was introduced as having fought the Russians during World War II. You would have thought that even a fool would realize that that must have meant, given he was 98 years old and from Ukraine, that he was fighting on the side of Hitler in the Second World War, when Canada was, of course, making a massive sacrifice of its young men in that war against Hitler. 1 million Canadian volunteers came to Europe to fight Nazism, and many of them lie in war graves in Normandy and elsewhere in Europe. And their war graves were crying out in agony at what the scene was as it unfolded in the Canadian Parliament. You could say it's a strong statement, but Justin Trudeau danced on the graves of these Canadian heroes who gave their lives against Hitler, whilst back home their Parliament was cheering a Hitlerite to the rafters. Not that they had no idea who he was. Even if they hadn't any idea who he was, the mere arithmetic involved and the geography involved would have told them that this man must have been fighting with Hitler against the Russians in World War II. Who else could he have been fighting for? Was he a lone gunman fighting the Russians in the Second World War? But even if that's all they knew, it should have kept them on their beam end rather than up like clapping seals on their feet. But they did know. As a matter of fact, Prime Minister Trudeau met this man before the event. And thus the Speaker of the Canadian Parliament has been thrown to the wolves as a sacrificial goat. The blame does not lie solely with him. The blame lies with two others in the government, at least two others in the government of Justin Trudeau. First, the buck stops with him. He's the Prime Minister. He's the one that's worked himself and the Canadian media and has tried to whip the Canadian people into a paroxysm of anti-Russian hatred, which reached such a peak that anyone would be applauded if they'd fought against the Russians anytime, anywhere. Not thinking that in the Second World War things were rather different. The 100,000 Canadians who gave their lives or their limbs, who gave their blood on the beaches of Juno and Normandy and elsewhere, cry out now for justice. But there's a second person in this frame. The second most important person in the Canadian government. Freeland is her name. She's the finance minister, the deputy prime minister, and undoubtedly saw herself as the next general secretary of NATO. That's right. after the Norwegian tailor departs, Christie Freeland intended to sail for Brussels and the top job in NATO. Now, this event would probably have knocked that on the head, because she was the one, and is the one, that next to Trudeau pushes hardest for this extremist line on the Russia-Ukraine conflict, such that Canada, once the kinder, gentler North American state, loved by most people in the world as a peace-loving place, has become the most warlike, the most warmongering, the most hawkish country in the Western world, and that is saying something. Britain running it a close second, the United States only third place compared to both of those. But there's another reason why Freeland will not be going to Brussels now. Because I can reveal to those who don't already know that Freeland's grandfather was a Nazi newspaper publisher in occupied Ukraine in the Second World War. He was the mouthpiece for Hitler, the pogroms, the Holocaust, the Waffen-SS, the Holocaust in the East, the mass murder at Babi Yar, the mass murder of Jews, of Poles, of partisans, of Ukrainians who did not want to collaborate with Hitler and the Nazis. She claims not to know what her grandfather did in the war. And if you believe that, I have a bridge here in London I could sell you going cheap. Freeland's grandfather was a Nazi propagandist during the fascist occupation of Ukraine in the Second World War. So begin to ponder this mix. Trudeau, the high-heeled Jack, as I called him, the walking, talking emblem of wokeness, has become such an obsessive against Russia and China that he has lost any sense of perspective. That's the only explanation there can be for meeting with a 98-year-old veteran of the Waffen-SS, the SS that was declared a criminal organization, the whole organization. For those idiots who like to claim that not everyone in the Waffen-SS was bad, there are such people, actually liberal people, now claiming that on social media, but the Nuremberg Tribunal knocks that on the head. The entire SS was declared a criminal organization. Ipso facto, every member of it was, and if they're still alive, is a criminal, a war criminal, because the legion of atrocities, of massacres committed by these people is so long and so unspeakable anyway, that before the watershed it is difficult to adumbrate. I just ask you to watch Steven Spielberg's The Final Days, about the mass murder of the Jews in Hungary by the SS and the Hungarian Nazis, the Hungarian equivalents of Hunka and the other Nazis in the Galicia division of that Waffen-SS in the Ukraine. These local satellites of Nazi Germany were worse than the mass murderers of the SS. No Jew in Ukraine made it to the gas chambers. They were cut down where they stood. They were thrown into pits and mass murdered in those pits covered in lime, after the final assassins had walked across their bodies, writhing in the pits, murdering anything that moved, just to be sure. Who did those mass murderings? The Germans stood back and smoked. It was the Ukrainian Nazis that committed the massacre of Babi Yar. Babi Yar, where hundreds of thousands of Jews and others were massacred, was carried out by Ukrainians, the very kind of Ukrainians, now celebrated in towns and cities all over Ukraine, with statues and streets being renamed and buildings called after them. And the kind of Ukrainian that got a standing ovation by every single member of Parliament in the Canadian Parliament just a few days ago. But it gets even worse than that. Do you know who was in the audience? Do you know who gave a standing ovation to a veteran of the SS mass murdering machine? Do you know who was also on her feet, rapturously applauding? That's right. The German ambassador to Ukraine. The German ambassador to Kiev was up on her feet applauding. This is beginning to look like history repeating itself. We've got the official representative of the German government applauding an SS veteran in Canada. We've got German tanks on the ground, burning actually, in the Ukraine, on the Ukrainian steppe where once they invaded and came within a couple of kilometers of Moscow itself. Raus! Raus! Achtung! These words, this tongue, is heard again on the former territory of the USSR. This history is repeating itself. If not for what happened a few days ago, Freeland would have been in Brussels, running NATO. The first head of NATO was a former Nazi general. And the next General Secretary of NATO was going to be the granddaughter of the Nazis' chief propagandist in occupied Ukraine. And so what has happened and why this is an inflection point is that which had been an undercurrent about the Nazification of Ukraine is now burst wide open as a worldwide phenomenon. That's why they've all gone quiet over there. That's why the Twibbons are quietly being removed and pulled down. That's why Western statesmen are struck dumb. Did you hear Sunak or Cleverly or Blinken or Biden condemning what happened in Canada? I did not hear a word from them because, frankly, there's really not much that can be said. The balls burst. It's all out in the open now. That which Putin had claimed and was laughed at, the need to denazify Ukraine, and as it turns out, way more than Ukraine, is now clear and obvious to everyone. All over North America, there are monuments, shrines to Nazis, to members of the SS in Canada, in the United States, and everywhere where these former prisoners of war were sent. They are, of course, now second, third, fourth, fifth generations, the progeny of these mass killers. And not that many of them seem to have disavowed the ideology and actions of their forefathers. So we have a Nazi problem in the West. We have a Nazi problem in NATO. They have a big Nazi problem in Canada and a giant Nazi problem in Ukraine. Try selling that the next time you're asking your taxpayer to stump up even more scores of billions in your currency to keep that regime in Kiev afloat. Now, let me turn briefly to the other big story of the week. Newspeak. George Orwell's 1984 looking increasingly like an instruction manual rather than a novel warning us of the dangers of authoritarianism, of totalitarianism that we thought we had defeated in 1945, but we had not. Its seeds have proliferated and are now fructifying amongst the political class and the managerial class that work for them all over the Western world. The idea that the Online Safety Bill, now Act, in Britain will allow a censor to decide what you can see, not on the television, not what you can listen to on the radio, no, what you can watch on the internet. The internet, the global frontier that was going to set us all free to find the points of view, the analysis that we felt we wanted or needed in order to make valued judgments on the great issues of the day, foreign and domestic. That internet in Britain is now in the hands of Ofcom and a woman you've never heard of who can decide to tell YouTube, to tell Twitter or X or Instagram or Facebook or any of the other social media companies, take that down. Take George Galloway's show down. Not because he said anything illegal. Not even because they think it's misinformation. They call it malinformation, which means it might well be true, but we don't believe that that information is in the public interest. And if the social media company refuses to take it down, they will be fined up to millions of pounds for their refusal. And of course, that means they're going to take it down. And so, any day now, some of the people that you follow, that you go to for information or maybe just for an alternative point of view, will not be there because the British state censor has taken them down. Is that what your father fought in the Second World War for? Is that what your grandparents endured the Second World War for? That we, who used to call ourselves the free world, are now amongst the most unfree of them all. And to put a tin hat on it, because Rumble, a foreign corporation, a capitalist outfit, for business reasons, refuse to remove he who I cannot name, or algorithm will kill this show. Rumble is about to be banned in Britain. Turns out it's already banned in France. Can you believe it? And if they ban Rumble, how long before they ban Twitter? They hate Elon Musk because he has nailed his colours to the mast. He's for Trump and not for Biden. He's for peace in the Ukraine and not for war. He's skeptical about all these lockdowns and never-ending injections. He can't be relied upon, Mr. Musk. And above all, perhaps, he's returned some semblance, at least, of freedom of speech on his platform. Rumble today, Twitter tomorrow, why not? It's said of serial killers that once they've murdered their first, each subsequent victim is more easily murdered. They get into the habit, you see. The murder of freedom of speech is well underway in this country and almost certainly in your country, wherever you are. I'll be right back with expert testimony. Stay tuned.